Good afternoon. Welcome to Medyascope TV. Today we're very happy to host Professor Ersin Kalaycıoğlu from Sabancı University, who is a professor of political science. Welcome, Professor.
Hello.
This time it will be an English broadcast, and it will be centered around the question of whither Turkish politics. We will try to understand how Turkey got to where it is and what are the prospects for its future. Professor Kalaycıoğlu, we have only 30 minutes and a very big question, so we have a lot to cover, a lot to talk about. We'll do our best. But before we start talking about the latest elections that Turkey went through, let's try to put things into perspective for our viewers who may not be especially familiar with the history of Turkish politics, and then we'll try to take it from there. So Turkey adopted the multi-party system in 1946, and most recently this system of government was most recently replaced by an executive presidency as a result of the 2017 referendum. So what happened in the meantime? How did we get here?
I hope I won't confuse our listeners any further than they're confused about Turkish politics, because Turkish politics has become increasingly mind-boggling over the years. I'm not so sure whether we need to go back to 1946, but in 1946, Turkey started to be on the same list as the new democracies of that time, which was defined as the second wave of democratization by Samuel Huntington in his famous book, The Third Wave. And Turkey had a Westminster-like uni-chamber parliamentary democracy at the time. However, at the very beginning, the 1946 elections were not democratic elections. They were not considered as either free nor fair. So under those circumstances, the opposition gave very clear signals that they would not be participating in these elections, upcoming elections of, they were, I think, midterm elections in 1948, if the law does not change completely. And they started to negotiate with the government. Main opposition party, the Democrats, and the main government party, the Republican People's Party, started the negotiations. Other newly established parties, such as the Millet Partisi, or Nation Party in English, also somewhat participated in that process. And by the 1950 national legislative elections, they agreed upon the rules of the game, such that the votes would be secret ballot, basically, and the count would be public, which had been reversed in 1946. So in 1950, they took the first step towards a fair electoral process. Also, the campaign activities would be administered by the independent judiciary. In this process, they agreed that the executive branch of the government, the governors, sub-provincial governors, kaymakam in Turkish, would be playing no role in it. Only the judges and the prosecutors would be playing some role according to the stipulated rules of the new law. And they would be responsible for the whole process. And the executive branch, especially the police and the rural police, gendarmerie, would take part in it upon the request of the judges, but not by the order of the governors, the wali of the provinces, or the sub-governors, the kaymakam. So this was a major step in the direction of establishing the position of the independent judiciary as sort of a referee between the political parties in their contest for power. And 1950 turned out to be the first free and fair election in Turkish politics, and has been accepted as such since then. It was accepted as such then, and also right now there's no qualms about it. But in 2017 and 18, several changes were made in the election laws, especially Act number 298, and these reintroduced the role of the executive branch of the government Now governors and sub-governors play a part in the selection of polling station personnel for the first time since the 50s. And the whole process, therefore, has gone back from the 1950 standard towards the 1946 standard under those circumstances. And also the campaign process is heavily skewed in the direction of the government's presence, especially in the mainstream media, where hours and hours of messages are given by the major figures of the government party, and the opposition cannot find much space or time to air its own campaign positions in the mainstream media any longer. So under these circumstances, various reports drawn up by the OSCE, for example, indicated that the campaign process indicates an unfair process in essence. Now, these changes of 2017 and 2018 is also part and parcel of those changes from this parliamentary format to the what you call the executive presidency. It's actually unaccountable and uncontrolled presidency that Turkey developed after 2017. This was a process which started after the series of events which took part more or less from 2007 onwards. The current constitution of Turkey was drawn up in 1982 in what had been considered as a Soviet threat at the time. Therefore, the emphasis was that there should be a strong state, which the founders of the Constitution assumed that a strong state could be established by a very powerful executive branch of government, which would be under the control both of a president elected by the Turkish Grand National Assembly, on the one hand, for a single term for 7 years, but this president would be totally unaccountable. Article 105 of the Constitution rendered him unaccountable for the ex officio decisions that the president made. Also put all responsibility on the shoulders of the prime minister and the council of ministers for any other decision. And the list of ex officio decisions that the president could make were also very, very long. In Article 104, had many executive decisions, judicial decisions, and legislative decisions that could be made by the president directly, for which the president would be totally unaccountable. So this created a tutelary system by the presidency by 1982. And the basic assumption was that the presidents would be looking after the collective interests of the realm, which the founders of the Constitution assumed that the elected politicians would not. They would be involved in the game of patronage, so they would be acting in ways that would create almost any condition so long as they win an election, and therefore they could compromise all values very easily to win an election. So they were not dependable. And the presidents would be dependable, and they would come from a completely different background, originally military background, who would be the guardians of the collective interests of the Turkish society and Turkish politics, in essence. That was the basic understanding. Now, political parties had been critical to this from the very beginning. There was no political party that supported the 1982 Constitution. Therefore, its legitimacy had always been on shaky ground, although it had the support of about 90% of the electorate or 80% of the electorate in 1982, where 90% of the people participated in the elections, and 90% of that 90% voted in favor of the electoral, in favor of the new Constitution. So under those circumstances, it had enormous popular support from the presidential system with a huge majority. They wanted to candidate for the parliamentary candidate would be elected in the Grand National Assembly. Outside of it, put up a stiff fight. And in that process, they said, okay, from now on, we're proposing a referendum and ask the people to make a decision as to how the president should be elected, whether by popular vote or the parliamentary vote. And this referendum took place on the 21st of October, 2007, and approximately almost 70%, it's actually 69% of the people turned out, participated in the election. They wanted popular vote. So Turkey legally became semi-presidential on that day, in October 2007, simply because the new system was one that the president would be directly elected by popular vote, and the legislature would be elected by, directly elected by popular vote, and then the legislature would elect from within its own ranks a prime minister and the council of ministers who would be responsible to the legislature. And that is the definition for semi-presidentialism.
So the 2007 referendum, we could say that it's often overlooked in importance.
Very
as
important.
It laid the basis for
it was a major regime change from what we had as a semi-parliamentary system. A parliamentary system with a tutelary power of president added on top of that, and creating a cumbersome and not so neat process of operation, in a sense. And this was more or less jettisoned in favor of semi-presidentialism as of 2007, legally. Because before the referendum, in August of 2007, President Gül was elected in the Grand National Assembly by about 440 voting for him out of 550 seats, a huge majority this time. So the issue was solved, actually. We could have continued with this process of electing the president in the Grand National Assembly, but the referendum changed all of that because it was a binding referendum, and therefore, as of October 2007, Turkey became semi-presidential. But the same system continued until 2014, for 7 years. And the first semi-presidential election took place in August of 2014, when the current president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, was elected as the first and the last president of the semi-presidential system in 2014. But in this interim period, Turkey went through a major constitutional reform, especially focusing on the judiciary. And in 2010, 12th of September, there was another referendum. And in that referendum, again, about 58% of the people voted in favor of changing the constitution, which enabled an overhaul of the judiciary. The former secular positivist judges and prosecutors were eliminated. In their place, a group of more conservative judges and prosecutors were ushered in. A process which did not necessarily mature immediately and did not have a big effect all of a sudden, but there was a botched coup attempt in 2016 on the 15th of July. And after that process, it was discovered that many of these judges and prosecutors came from a certain interest group, and therefore they were also eliminated, and more loyalist type of, more conservative judges and prosecutors were ushered in. So the basic argument made, especially by the opposition today, is that the judiciary has lost its impartiality and independence. It's too close to the government because of this waves of purges that have taken place in the judiciary. In the same time, in 2011, 1 year after that referendum, there was another major national election. In that election, the Justice and Development Party won the majority of the seats again in the Grand National Assembly. And with that, they started a new initiative of improving the powers of the Prime Minister's office, centralizing most of these decisions. There were a lot of autonomous agencies monitoring the press, the media, banking system, etc. They were all more or less brought into the realm of the Prime Minister's office as agencies of that office. Their autonomy were completely abolished. As a result of which, Turkey has started on a path of enormous centralization or re-centralization to the detriment of decentralization that Turkey had gone through between 1980s until about 2010s. And that is a process that continued over time and carried over from the Prime Minister's office to the President's office. Today, Turkey is going through one of the most centralized political organizations of its entire history currently. And this is a process that, again, started in 2011. That is the first time we see a large number of executive orders coming out of the Prime Minister's office at the time, because that was the one that was powerful then. And these executive orders were put into effect when the majority of the seats were in the hands of the same political party as that of the Prime Minister. So it didn't make much sense, but that set the pace for what was to follow after 2016. And then from 2013 onwards, Turkey got into a new political crisis with a series of protests occurring first, and then some kind of accusations of corruption, which were made into a series of allegations about a conspiracy to topple the government. And from then on, Turkey went into a relatively unstable process of experiencing 7 elections between 30th of March 2014 and 31st of March 2019. First was a local election, 30th of March 2014, which started the process, but it was, the local elections are held at the same day across the country. Therefore, they are sort of, it's an oxymoron, but national local elections, or nationally experienced local elections, and therefore they have national consequences, just as the ones that we had right on the 31st of March, and we're still discussing the consequences of that election. So 2014 had those local elections in March. In August was the presidential elections, where Turkey moved into semi-presidentialism. Then 2015, we had 7th of June 2015 national legislative elections, in which the Justice and Development Party lost for the first time the majority of seats in the Grand National Assembly. They didn't lose the election. They got the plurality of the votes and plurality of the seats in the Grand National Assembly, but not the majority for the first time. And this was a big, big step. So they had to form some kind of a coalition government, which they abhorred. So in consequence, they tried not to establish a coalition government during that summer. And it provided the opportunity to the president at the time, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, to abolish this process and abolish the legislature and go for early elections, snap elections. For the Constitution stipulated that if in 45 minutes, in 45 days of the election, if no government is established, then the president could call for early elections. It is a possibility, not a necessity, but that possibility was actually materialized and then used by the president to call for early election. And on the 1st of November 2015, we had another election, legislative election. And this time, the Justice and Development Party won the majority of the seats in the Grand National Assembly. Now, 1 year later, we had the botched coup attempt, and then following that, the new process was initiated in October of 2016 by the National Action Party leadership, who pushed for a change in the Constitution, amending major articles, and creating a new system in which there would be a presidential system rather than a semi-presidential system in which the president would still hold the basic status that it had in the past of a parliamentary presidential office, that is irresponsible and unaccountable office, above the fray of politics, more associated with the collective interests. That kind of style would be kept, but at the same time, it would become a executive presidency, more like an American presidency, which would be involved not in the administrative decision-making that the presidents had been involved in from 1982 onwards, but in political decision-making as well, exclusively, since the prime minister's office would be abolished, and also the council of ministers would be abolished. Instead, there would be the cabinet of the president, who would now be ruling the country as if Turkey were a presidential system. So under these circumstances, Turkey went for a referendum on the 16th of April 2017, and this system changed. So we changed from semi-presidential to uncontrollable and unaccountable presidential. But before semi-presidentialism, we had semi-parliamentary. So parliamentary, semi-presidential, presidential. And this happened in a very short period of time.
So Professor Kalaycıoğlu, in order to economize our time, because we don't have much left, I'm wondering whether we would be able to integrate the remainder of your response to our next question, which would ideally be focused on where Turkey is headed from this point onwards. But we would be doing our viewers an injustice if we skip this interim period that we're in right now, that started perhaps, if you will, with the March 31st local elections. So before we keep talking any further, I'd just like to ask you quite directly, what makes the March 31st elections different? What makes it unique? What makes it significant?
Well, it's a local election. However, at this local election, since it's held on the same day nationally, it has national consequences. It gives an indication as to where the voters are heading. And it looks as if those voters on the western part of the country, southern part of the country, coastal areas, also around Ankara in the middle, and certain other parts in the east and the northeast and southeast, seem to have been changing their votes away from the Justice and Development Party and the MHP enough, not wholesale perhaps, but enough for them to lose some very critical mayoral seats. That's the basic result. And also because of these changes that had been taking place since 1980s in improving the powers of the local governments in Turkey, some of these, especially major metropolitan areas, have relatively large resources, which have been used lavishly over the last 30 years or so. So they would be losing a lot of these management of these major sources of patronage, in a sense. So it has big economic as well as political results.
And
so
what does this tell us for the future of domestic politics in Turkey? If
I tie it back to what I've been talking about, is that now Turkey has a new system. The old system is gone. The new system is not established properly. All of the institutions have been eroded, and they're not functioning well. The Grand National Assembly has lost a lot of its teeth and fangs in this process. Therefore, it's not in a position to effectively control the executive branch of the government. And the judiciary is also considerably under the influence of the executive branch of the government. Its independence and impartiality has been debated, especially between the opposition and the government. And of course, if you look at the various comparative indices of, for example, the indices calculated by the World Justice Project, or Bertelsmann's Quality of Democracy Index, or the VDEM Index, or the Economist's democracy index, Turkey seemed to be sliding completely, and their scores on judicial independence and judicial impartiality seems to be suffering, second most to civil liberties. So these are major areas that Turkey seems to be lagging behind in comparative studies. So in consequence, without effective control, enormously centralized system, which emphasizes the president for most decision-making, with very little checks and balances, created a major consequence of, number one, decision-making time for political decisions have become increasingly long. Many decisions are not being made or postponed. Secondly, decisions are not coming out of deliberation of many people, sort of a multiplicity of minds clashing with each other and creating an environment for effective decision-making. Instead, decisions are being made relatively small number of people, and therefore it looks as if their legitimacy, especially in the eyes of the opposition, seems to become questionable. That's number two. And the ministries seem not to be involved in this process, where, as you know, in all democracies in the world, various executive bureaucracies are usually involved in day-to-day routine affairs of the land, and when an urgent situation come up, they are in a position to influence the situation and take urgent and emergency decisions, whether it's an economic crisis or foreign policy issue, etc. It looks as if we seem to be also not being involved in that kind of situation effectively. For Turkey has gone through, is still experiencing an economic crisis in which decision-making is, again, not very effective, and it's been sort of continuing for a long period of time in which there is considerable amount of instability. And therefore, many policy areas seem to be suffering. And this is getting a lot of criticism, whether these policy areas are now the portfolios of the ministers or the ministries and the bureaucracy as they should be, or just in the hands of the presidential apparatus, which is not geared up to deal with all of these relatively complex matters all at the same time. So this is creating a governance problem for Turkey, and therefore that is also a major phenomenon that seems to be influencing the voters' decisions. Therefore, will the voters' decisions be only influenced in these local elections, or whether it has any reference to future, we will have to see.
Soon, we're going to have to start wrapping up with a final question. But before we do that, I'd like to ask a penultimate question. So very briefly, is Turkey a democracy in the technical sense of the term? What does political science tell us?
Well, most of these measures that I've referred to Turkey as a hybrid regime. It's somewhere between a democracy and an authoritarian system. It is a hybrid regime simply because, as we have seen in these local elections, the government did lose and can lose elections. In authoritarian systems, governments do not lose elections. So that makes Turkey somewhat less than an authoritarian system. But the elections, the quality of elections also leave much to aspire to become democratic elections. We have various civil liberty issues. We have various freedom of expression issues. We have various sort of level playing field of campaign practices, related issues. And we have, therefore, been more or less debating and discussing whether the elections are democratic elections, whether they are free and fair, whether their freeness and fairness have been in debate. So there are a large number of issues that we're debating, but so far, since governments can lose elections, it gives a good indication that in essence, Turkey is caught between democracy, especially liberal democracy, where representative institutions matter. They don't. Our representative institutions, especially the Grand National Assembly, has suffered a lot of erosion. And therefore, it's not very effective. It functions more like a talking shop right now than a sort of checking and balancing institution, the kind that the US Congress plays in the US system, for example. So there's no resemblance that we have to that kind of performance under these circumstances. So we seem to have veered away from democratization, but at the same time, we have not fully arrived at an authoritarian system. We seem to be caught somewhere in between. Therefore, it's a hybrid regime in between.
And finally, Professor Kalaycıoğlu, I know it's very hard to put such a response in a few sentences, but unfortunately that's what I'm going to have to ask you to do. Is Turkey at a crossroads after the March 31st local elections? What are the options?
Well, if a different analogy would be better suited. Turkey seems to have entered the dead-end street. So far as this regime is concerned, it will not be performing as a democratic system, even if it wants to, because there are many deficiencies with this system. The checks and balances, the control mechanisms are not in place. They are not effective. The judiciary is not effective. The legislature is not working well. Also, the media is not very effective. It had problems in the past, but not to this extent. And at the same time, the overall environment, especially for opposition, is not very well suited. We had calamitous developments so far as the opposition was concerned. The most important opposition party, CHP's leader, was almost lynched a few days ago. These are not good signs for a political regime that aspires to be a democracy, simply because you have to have strong opposition for democracy to exist. And opposition is the most important discerning characteristic of a democracy. Government parties or government forces or governing bodies or governing figures exist in all political systems, totalitarian or authoritarian, but opposition is only vibrant, important, as a potential for future government in a democracy. So with weak opposition is a big problem for smooth operation of democracy, and that is also a matter that meets the eye very, very effectively. And various changes through this process, these amendments that have taken place, had also diminished the potential for parliamentary immunity greatly. Parliamentarians can be charged with serious crimes, and the opposition, again, does not accept these crimes to be totally correct. And they can be incarcerated for long periods of time, and they can be also put on trial on these bases. And that also is debilitating the opposition's capability of contestation or contesting the power of the day, the government party, and the executive branch of the government. Therefore, these are the basic problems that we're facing with. And of course, it's a long road from here back to democratization, where Turkey had been before 2011 or so, when it started to divert from the path to democratization.
On that note, we can end today's broadcast. Professor Kalaycıoğlu, thank you very much for being with us today and for your comments. Today, we were joined by Professor Ersin Kalaycıoğlu from Sabancı University, and we talked about the past, present, and the future of Turkish politics in light of the most recent March 31st local elections. Thanks for watching.